Hi, everybody. My name is Amelia Poussin. Welcome back to the Global Emergency Medicine Fellowship Consortium online lecture series. We are so excited this month. It's the beginning of spring, and we have an appropriately blooming talk from Dr. Ellen Weber. I am so excited that she's going to be speaking to us. Dr. Weber is incredibly accomplished. She's a professor of emergency medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. She's the editor-in-chief of EMJ, Emergency Medicine Journal. She's a fellow of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine in the UK and of American College of Emergency Medicine and a former board member for SAEM. She's a graduate of Harvard Medical School and trained at UCSF, where she's practiced emergency medicine for over 30 years. So a real standout in our field for a variety of reasons. Her research interests include ED utilization, ED operations, quality of care, informatics, and peer review and publication. And for the past 10 years, she's been a visiting professor at Mohunbili National Hospital, where she's a research teacher and mentor for nurses, trainees in emergency and internal medicine, and faculty. Her work there has resulted in successful production of dissertations by EM residents and the publication of approximately 20 manuscripts in peer-reviewed journals on a range of emergency medicine topics, including trauma, triage, pediatrics, respiratory failure, GI bleeding, and renal failure, appearing in journals such as BMC Emergency Medicine, BMC Hematology, BMC Gastroenterology, Tropical Medicine and Health, Safety and Health, and BMJ Open, among others. Dr. Weber has also taught research in other areas of Tanzania and sub-Saharan Africa and is one of the co-creators of the research course for the African Federation of Emergency Medicine. In addition to all of that, she served as a mentor for the GloCal Fellowship sponsored by UCSF. She lives in California with her husband and their yellow lab, Mello, who's a career change dog from Guide Dogs for the Blind and apparently does not live up to the name of Mello, and enjoys hiking, puzzles, and reading, with her guilty pleasure being British mysteries. And I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Weber to take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Welcome everybody. And I think you've pretty much summed it up, Amelia. I'll just say that I was never a global health person till literally 10 years ago. I always wanted to work in a limited income country and help out and also see what my skills brought me. I didn't really have the opportunity until 10 years ago when Terry Reynolds, whose name you may know, she's now the head of emergency medicine at WHO, I don't know her exact title, was one of our fellows in ultrasound, and she was also a global health fellow at UCSF in their global health school, and she somehow managed to do both in one or whatever the 2 years are. She wound up helping get working with the Mohunbili Hospital because she was there doing ultrasound research. We were part of a grant that allowed faculty to go to Mohunbili that was just starting a residency and teach there. So for the first year or so, I came and did supervision of clinical work, teaching lectures and so forth. And then what happened for me was that I went to, so this is great, and I loved it. I just loved it. Just loved learning everything that was there, seeing how different and also how similar things were in so many ways. But also that what happened was I wound up doing a 2-month stint where most people were doing a 1 month. And that kind of gave me some leeway that people got to know me. They started asking me questions about their research. And, can you help me with this? I'm going to give this talk or, whatever. And I help people, from and I don't have a PhD. I don't have a master's in public health, just from years of doing research and editing. I was able to help them, and they all did really well. And several of them won prizes at meetings, and they thought I was just like this magical woman. And so they keep having me back. And so every year I return, kind of like Peter Pan, and I teach in Mohunbili about 5 or 6 research lectures, very basic, trying to get people to understand, what is research, how you do it, because they all have to do a dissertation to graduate. So those of you who are in fellowships and left a regular EM residency, thank your lucky stars that if you did not have to do a research project. They all do. And so we spend a lot of time after that talking about what their research topics will be, which they choose. And then I try to help them craft it into a good research question, objectives, and challenge them with, well, how are you going to do this? And how are you going to collect your data? And what are you going to do if you don't have research system 24/7? And we try to make the best uh, project we can that they have to do in a very short time, and then I help them with their data when they've gotten their data. They're interpreting their data and writing up their manuscripts, their dissertations, and occasionally I've been able to sit in by Zoom on their defense preparation. So it's been great because so every year there's like people leaving and there's people coming, and so it's a cycle, and that's just led me to be able to help in other places. And it's just been wonderful. Now I will just tell you, this is volunteer. Um, and that's one of the things I will just say that sometimes you only get to do this work when you have the bandwidth and you can afford it. So, but it's been a total blessing for me. It just totally has changed my life. So that's my background story. And so many of the examples I'll give in this talk are going to be from Tanzania, where I have done my clinical work. I haven't been in I've been in some other African countries now. It's so funny to say that. Like, I hadn't been to Africa before 10 years ago, and now I've been to like 4 countries. Woo-hoo. So anyway, so that's where my experience is from. But what I want to talk today about is kind of a mixture of those things, because my life has sort of come together in this way that I am the editor-in-chief of the Emergency Medicine Journal. That's published in the UK. And so as part of that, and then with understanding how people early in their career are facing research, I've gotten to know a lot about what people do right and what people do wrong in research, and particularly in getting published. So today, Bhakti and Amelia asked me to talk about where you should publish international research, why you should publish international research, and a little bit about how you can be successful in doing that. So I'm going to start this presentation. Okay, see this? Yeah, okay, great. Because my internet is unstable, please tell me to read something if I. So here's the story. Want to publish international research to increase your chances for success in getting published. So why publish?
And I'm just going to reinforce, since I interrupted already, any questions that you guys have, feel free to voice them, or if you don't want to voice them, or you can't voice them for bandwidth issues, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll moderate from there.
Thanks. Yeah, great. So you probably may all know this, but I think one of the things that I now understand, having worked now in another country, is that our literature is totally based on high income countries. And basically it's like we have seen only one side of the moon. So we're missing a lot of information about the severity of illness, the types of illness. The data we have may not generalize to other countries that have not been studied. And there's some diseases in other countries that are potentially either recognized or understudied. That in terms of like, what we consider often are, diseases from developing countries like cholera and typhoid and malaria and so forth. And some of them have been very well studied and others have not, because no one there that's been able to study them. And then there are also other kinds of problems that people aren't aware of that are happening now in limited and middle income countries. And we need to show that these things are happening and show potentially how diseases we think are very familiar are different in these countries. So the second thing is, I think that research, particularly in emergency medicine, it's a very new specialty. And so we have a chance to be kind of the canary in the coal mine about what is going on in limited and middle income countries. And so we can reveal diseases that haven't really been considered. So my examples from Tanzania are When I got there, I had no idea how many people had really bad hypertension, had early renal failure. Wasn't the ED was not filled with malaria and TB. It was filled with people with hypertensive emergencies and strokes and trauma. And most of these things are not really well funded. Everybody's still funding HIV and malaria in Africa. So being able to publish about what we see in the emergency department or even in the population, doesn't have to be an EM, could help redirect funding. And this is just one example. When I got to Mohambili, the day one, I see this CAT scan, and obviously it's a huge intracerebral hemorrhage. And the person, of course, had been, didn't come there for 3 or 4 days, not necessarily because they delayed being seen, but they'd gone to prior hospitals before they could get a scan. Well, one of the things that seems to be true, at least in Tanzania, is that hemorrhagic stroke are at least 50% of the types of strokes. If you read any of our textbooks, say that hemorrhagic strokes are 20%. When everyone talks about a stroke, they talk about ischemic strokes. But there's no matter how well it's been documented, hemorrhagic strokes. So same diseases, but maybe different profiles, possibly because of the severe hypertension that's there. I have many others. I'm just going to keep going, and we can always try other ones. A third one, of course, is that we need to improve the care of both settings. So we've used emergency medicine and basically all of our research to train people who are in emergency medicine in our image, and that would not be the right thing to do. We don't know. Different population, they have different resources, so we can't go scan everybody. And so what we do, our algorithms may or may not work either because the population's different, the diseases are somewhat different, or they simply don't have the ability to do that. One example is if you talk about in trauma, we talk about the golden hour. Well, there's no golden hour in Tanzania because there's no pre-hospital care. And on average, people with polytrauma get to the trauma center, which is Mohambili, in 6 hours. So we can't talk about some of these things that we think are your best care. And as I said, many other diseases are understudied because they're not common in high-income countries, but they are in low and middle-income countries. And also, because of the resource limitations in different populations or proportion of people with certain diseases, limited income countries should and may have to develop new medications, diagnostics, and treatment. So we have to make sure that the care that we're reaching is actually working. This is a classic example of where we try to take a high income, country intervention, which was for sepsis, and where it just flopped and was actually harmful in Africa. This was the feast trial where they showed for children with sepsis, those who got boluses had a much higher mortality rate than those who got a bolus of fluid. So we started to learn that we can't give particularly malnourished and anemic children fluid. But this kind of also had everybody start thinking about, really, should we be giving so much fluid? And now our own sepsis care is changing because we're thinking, well, maybe we're overloading people. So this kind of added to our own literature on the idea that maybe we're not shouldn't be flooding everybody with fluid, that it has to be much more individualized. Then the other thing is just the innovations that are going on there. These are kind of small ones, but there's a myriad number of uses of empty plastic Coke bottles. One is to use it as a spacer for an inhaler. And this was what we did in the emergency department. I just love this. You all know, for ultrasound in our departments, we use those little white, dispensers. They're one-use maybe 16-ounce bottles. So in Mohambili, what they had was they got this vat essentially of gel, and they would refill this Coke bottle with it. And that was the gel. And I just thought that was just, kind of a brilliant way to save money and, save the environment, actually. Um, and then, of course, you want to publish because this may help you get promoted and get a new job and so forth. So lots of reasons to publish. Okay. And I think you all know many of these, maybe have other reasons as well. But I think it's really important that we get the word out there as to what is this half of science that we haven't seen. This is, by the way, one other innovation that unfortunately this resident never published it, but they looked at very early on before most people have been thinking about this of using IM insulin or sub-Q insulin for DKA, and found it as effective as IV infusions, which in this department at the time that this was being done was really important because they didn't have any pumps to run insulin infusions, and things were getting really messed up and delayed and so forth. So this was something that unfortunately he didn't publish it, but was actually something that had he, would have helped contribute to the current research that's going on. Because right now, for most people, we're using this particular form of insulin if you're going to give it sub-Q or IM. Okay, so now the question becomes, and this was part 2, is so where do you publish? So why are we even asking this question? Well, there are some challenges to getting published in general, and I would say more challenges in getting published in global health, especially EM. So what are those? So first of all, EM journals in the US and probably in other high-income countries like the European Journal of Emergency Medicine, my journal, which is the Emergency Medicine Journal. There's a limited amount of, shall we say, space for appetite for global research. And the reason for that is that there's a couple of things. One is it's really difficult a lot of readers just don't see the relevance to them of this work. Secondly, and I'm sorry I'm not saying this in order, the research priorities in limited middle-income countries may be more basic than the kind of research we're publishing from the US or the UK or Canada. There's still a lot of need for descriptive studies. What are we seeing in these departments? What are the mortality rates? A lot of this, especially, is a need for just multi-center studies, regional studies to see what is the burden of disease, what are the outcomes, and try and then maybe look at management and then try to figure out what can be improved. So this is something that potentially, journals that are publishing randomized trials or, at least, analytic observational trials with multivariate analysis may not feel is sophisticated enough. And also, despite, even in addition to the fact that we need descriptive studies, it is sometimes difficult in the setting for researchers in these countries to find the expertise, the statisticians and so forth, to make the work more sophisticated, to do an analytic study where they look at, risk factors or survival curve and to do it right. So to get an article up to the kind of sophistication that a lot of EM journals want may be difficult. And if you want to just publish descriptive work, they may not be interested. Especially because right now, a lot of these are single hospital or 2 hospitals. The second thing is that we want research in limited income countries to be easily accessible. And we want it also to be able to, if possible, be in, very noticeable in the country the work is being done in, but a lot of these countries don't have their own journals. So in any case, so we have to try to publish open access, but open access fees are high, and waivers, it really depend on what journal and who your authors are. So that's another thing to consider. It is really, I think, important that if you're doing work and that where you want the people in that country or other similar countries to know what you found, you try to publish an open access. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The other thing is very high impact journals, Lancet, JAMA, BMJ, they have just very high thresholds to publish anything, and they just generally refer RCTs, and they may also refer systematic reviews. I was just scanning what JAMA has been publishing in international work, and most of them are systematic reviews. And that it's really hard to do an RCT, especially when you are starting out, and especially if you have a co-author in the country, they're not going to have a lot of money or funding, and funding is an issue in general for global health work. The sources for that are not as large as we have for funding within our own country. And then another challenge is that I've seen is most journals will refer almost anything done in EM to an EM specific journal. So I work at EMJ, which is a British medical journal publication, and we have like 50 journals, and one of them is Global Health, the BMJ Global Health. And I get a lot of papers transferred from BMJ Global Health simply because they're EM. Now, we are a hybrid journal, so we can publish open access. But so you run into that problem, and I've run into that my whole career, which is if the minute you put EM down, somebody sends you to a specialty journal, and JAMA and New England Journal and all those places, don't want to look at it. But unless it's an RCT. So that's another challenge we have. So lots of challenges, but still very, very doable. But just want to keep those in mind as you think about where you're going to publish and how you're going to publish. So I just Google, what does Google say that are journals that take global health papers? It's not a small number. And some of these you've never heard of, like pathogens in global health. And probably unless you're doing basic research, you're not going to publish there. But you're going to see there's a lot of actual global health types of and public health types of journals. And so that's one place that you can think, all of these places you can think about publishing. And some of them are open access. So PLOS is open access, BMJ Open is open access, BMJ Global Health is completely open access. And many of these also have an opportunity to be open access. And again, but with a charge. So that's one thing to look at. Then a new journal wasn't listed in Google is Advances in Global Health. And that's actually coming out of UCSF, where I work from our Global Health Institute. It tends to be more population oriented than EM, studies. And they have a very strong push on HIV because the funding that I think Global Health gets there is a lot of HIV funding. And there's also BMC journals has their own International Journal of Emergency Medicine, and they have other open access journals that you can think of depending on the topic. So they have Amelia mentioned some of the journals that we've published in, and a lot of them are BMC journals of the particular disease. So kidney or neuro or so forth. So you got to think about that. And then you can also consider looking at journals in the specific countries if they have them for EM. Sometimes they don't.
Maryland puts back.
So this is not the full list, but you could look for that country, particularly if you want you're interested in that country seeing it. So still a lot of opportunities. And then this is interesting that Lancet has regional health journals for wherever you're working. And I just learned about it. I didn't realize they had this. And so you can pick out wherever you're working. Again, Lancet, still a very high bar, likes RCTs, likes population health types of papers, but still, you never know. And it's now with all of these large journals having subjournals, it's easier to get published in them. Okay, now, one other way to find a journal is to, if you don't if you haven't looked at all those and you're not sure which, or you're still not sure what journal, if you don't know about this, is kind of a cool resource. It's called Jane. It's journal author name Estimator. I don't know why that's a weird name, but when you come to the page, this little box is open. It's just, and then what you can do is paste the abstract of your paper. And when you do that, this is the QR code, by the way, for this particular site, if you want to get to it. You put that in and you hit find journals down here. And it gives you this list of journals that this could possibly be published in. And you can see there's a lot of them. Some of them were in that Google list, some of them are not. This was a trauma paper, so it was there were a lot of trauma things that came up. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a global health journal. It happened to pick BMC Emergency Medicine as the top, and the confidence it should be because it was published in that journal. So it won't necessarily, if it's already been published, it may choose that at the top. If you don't have an abstract and you're still thinking about where am I going to publish, maybe you want to kind of aim your abstract at the journal. You can also put the keywords. So I put in global health, emergency medicine, diabetes. And I got another list. And they'll give you also what they call an influence, not the impact factor. But they also tell you whether they're good open access, whether they're indexed, and so forth. So this is a good resource in general for finding your papers. Not as great for trying to figure out which is the higher ranked and so forth, but still very good. So think about this as well, and that will also expand your thoughts about where to publish. I'll just give you one example. For me is we had a paper that was published that we submitted to Emergency Medicine Journal on triage, and we got got a rejection, not a rejection, or it was a rejection, but resubmit kind of. And we had the argument or the critique was something. It was about triage, and we showed that we saved some minutes on triage by changing the way we did the triage flow. This is not in a global health setting. But that we managed to get many more people into triage in a limited period in the 10 minutes they first came in. Well, we figured we were never going to be able to argue that, that was a critical number. It was an important number. They thought it's too many, it's too few. So we went to a totally different journal. We went to an IT journal because we had done this in a medical record. We had changed the medical records format. And so you got to think a little bit out of the box, and they did accept it after a year, but that's another story. So how do you choose your right journal? What should you think about? I think a lot of people want to go for the very top tier, and that may be a good idea if you've got a really strong paper and it's going to, if it does go to JAMA, New England Journal, Lancet, BMJ, it will probably get to your audience. But we're especially at this stage in your career, even in my career, it's a very high bar. So think about really what you really should be thinking about is who's your audience? Who is it you want to see your work? I was talking to Bhakti actually yesterday. She said she's published work in the South African Journal of Medicine. She does more public health kinds of work and a little less EM. She said, if I don't publish there, people won't see what I've done. And so it may not be the top tier journal. It may not have an impact factor that's very high, but it's a very important thing to publish where people can see the work that's going to help them. Think about what open access options. You can get them in both a subscription journal that will allow open access, and then there's open access only journals. And then think about, do you have the funding or do you need a waiver? And the waivers generally will come if they're the author, the first author at least, is from that local country and not America. So we've had some, I'm a mentor, and so initially I didn't even put my name on any of the papers, but then that my mentees were using, but then I realized that actually that was kind of like being a ghost author because I was contributing and there was no mention that they had had my contribution. So that's not really ethical either. So I now am on those papers, and that kind of messes them up a little bit because they have to go and say, well, she was our mentor, but we did the work, and then they usually will agree to it. So you have to think about how you'll get that waiver for open access if you need it. Then also make sure that the journal description coincides with your work. When you first read Lancet, I think over Lancet, first thing they say is RCTs or something like that. Well, I'm not there, so I'm really unlikely. And also, do they have it? Not only do they, there's a description match the kind of work. If they're very interested in HIV and you're publishing a paper that doesn't have HIV, it's not likely to get in there. So go somewhere else. But also, do they have an appropriate format to submit under? Because you may have a paper that just doesn't fit. Most will have an original research, but you may have some other kind of paper that they may not have a format for. One of the things, for example, in my journal, we don't do case reports, and I still get case reports sent to me, and it makes me furious. And I also get papers that don't, or in the wrong, people choose the wrong article type. And even though we have a description, because they can't really figure out what it is they've done. So make sure you use the appropriate format. Then think about the likelihood of acceptance, which is kind of like probably get some advice from other people. I like to look at whether they'll publicize my work. My first paper was, I tried to submit it to top, JAMA kind of thing. And then I wound up getting it published in Annals of Emergency Medicine. And I almost made a big deal of it. I went to a press conference and everything. So JAMA would never have done that for me because I was just one of their articles, wasn't a big deal. So you think about that as well. A very important, probably early on, is the turnaround time, and most journals will publish their turnaround time, so you know how long it takes them to make a decision. And then there's also the impact factor, and you do have to think about that. But I think especially early on, just think about getting published and getting published relatively quickly. Not that you hurry, but that maybe you go to a journal that doesn't take too long a time, especially if they're going to reject it. And that, of course, meets all these other criteria. Now, I want to just say that you don't need to confine your options to a journal that's identified as taking global health work. So when you're looking at the journals and your audience, it doesn't necessarily have to be a global health journal. So like, for instance, Buckley, she publishes in the South African Medical Journal. Maybe it's not considered a global health journal there. It's their journal. And many journals that are not, quote, taking, global health journals will take global health work, including my journal and other journals where I said they have a, quote, limited appetite. So how do you get your paper into any journal? So first of all, if you want to make a paper attractive to an EM or a general journal, do the following things. First of all, you consider this a research question that will generalize beyond the setting. That's really helpful for getting any kind of journal to pick it up. So any studies that address education and training, staff wellness, screening for chronic diseases, diagnostics, treatments, chronic illness management, all of those things generalize beyond where you did the study. They, they may not go all the way to, from Tanzania to the UK, but they may have a piece of truth in them about, for certainly the way we educate people. You do an educational study in Tanzania and learn that this kind of method works better than another. There's no reason to think it wouldn't be useful in the UK or the US. And so all of these things can generalize, and it's important basically then that when you write the paper, you explain what the problem is you're trying to solve, and mention why it's relevant beyond the setting. Okay, so just don't go in there and say, well, I did this study and such and such and so and so. Think about how it might be relevant beyond the setting, and that's how you might capture the attention of another journal that in and of itself might not have published this. Very important to have local authorship. This is my pet peeve. I see sometimes global health journals where there's 5 US authors and maybe one local author or maybe no local authors. And I call it out to the contributors. And why don't you have a local author? I personally believe that when you do your research, if you do research in another country, first of all, the choice of the research question ought to be that of the local researcher, not yours, unless you agree. I mean, you may say, look, I'm seeing this going on. What do you think about a study on this? Because maybe they don't realize that. Like I went into, Mobile, I said, people don't realize how sick your DKA patients are. They don't realize what kind of strokes you're having. You might consider doing a research study that talks about that. So you may have suggested, but really you want the local authors, if possible, to be the first author. For your reputation, maybe they'll be second author, but then have several authors. But that's a really we are now more and more looking at, because we don't want to be, imperialistic, basically. And then, of course, you'll have a better chance if you have a randomized or a multi-center observational study. Those are some tricks for taking a paper that you think is just done in Rwanda or someplace in Pakistan and making it one that I would be interested in it, because I think my readers will be interested in it. Okay, so that's just specifically how to sell your paper to why the global health work is relevant. Okay, now Bhakti mentioned, and I like to talk about also, how do you get your papers published in general? What are the other things you need to do to make sure you have a good paper? Because you could tell me from here till tomorrow that this is a very relevant paper, but if it's not a good paper, I'm still not going to publish it. So the first thing is, I can't see you all, but if you have not heard of this, it's very, very important that you use a research checklist when you not just when you write up your paper, but actually when you design your research. There are research checklists for every kind of type of research that you might do. They all have little names like Strobe and Prisma. And they each basically tell you from the title to the discussion what elements need to be written up. And when you look at that, you should then think, when you're planning your study, look at those and say, oh, okay, what am I going to, it's asked you, if you're doing an RCT, what are you going to do about blinding? And even if you're not doing an RCT, if you're doing a chart review, you would like the people who are abstracting from the chart, let's say you're doing a chart review looking at what are the risk factors for a certain outcome. You want the person who's abstracting the data not to know the outcome, so that there's no bias in the way they abstract or think about the data they're collecting. So it'll ask you questions like that. Who did the chart review? Were they blinded to the outcome? Did you do it to rate or reliability? So a lot of those questions will be to kind of, you have to think about that, and you plan that in your study. But then you also want to, when you write it, you want to make sure that your writing conforms to this, in the sense that everything they ask you about is in your paper. So do look at this. I've had people submit studies saying there is no guideline for their type of study. Well, I took this screech years ago. There's actually 480 reporting guidelines. So it's not likely that if you're new to research that you have come up with a new kind of study type. So chances are you just don't understand what kind of study you have. So figure out what kind of study you have and then download the checklist. So start with that. Now, a little bit more about getting your paper published. Your introduction really has to sell the research question. You have to tell me why the problem, what the problem is, why it's important, and how will your study help it. I'm just going to ask your selling research question. This is your sales pitch. Not, I'll tell you, let's talk about later, not your results, but why is this an important question? And what is the literature gap? Why did you need to do this study? Okay, what the problem, why is the problem not solved? And you may think my study is going to help solve this problem, even though there's been 5 studies before. They didn't do X, Y, or Z. My study is going to do something different, and I'm going to be able to contribute, not necessarily solve, but contribute to solving the problem. Okay, so that's really, really important. Now, and that research question has to be really clear. Okay, make sure your methods are really spot on. Do not scrimp on space in your methods. And I'm just going to mention these are in checklists, but make sure it's very clear who you included, who you excluded. You have to include your patient enrollment procedures. And as you do that, as you talk about things like enrollment procedures, you should talk about how you avoided selection bias. People are very concerned. One of the things, we have a recent paper on how there is so much selection bias in EM research because we collect data during the day, let's say, or on weekdays, and we're a 24/7 operation. So in order to avoid that, you need to basically, unless you're going to have a researcher there 24/7, what you do is you sample on representative shifts. So you do some nights, some days, some weekends. And so when you do that, you point that out. Don't just say you had a research assistant on, 12 hours a day. You point out it was on representative shifts. And then I know, that was a way you avoided selection bias. How the data was collected and by whom. And again, this often comes up to blinding if you're doing a study on pain. And maybe if it is a randomized study and one person's getting the treatment, the other person isn't, that the person who goes in to assess pain doesn't know which treatment people got. And if you're doing retrospective, as I mentioned, where the abstractor's blinded to the outcome. If you're doing surveys, it's really helpful to find a previously validated or at least survey or pilot yours. That's a big ding for people to go, unvalidated survey, and it's considered really not a very strong study. Now, there are places you have to do a survey that's not been done before, but do try to find something that you can work from. And then clear statement of what your outcomes are going to be, a sample size estimation. Even if you just use a pragmatic sample size, you should say that. And then very important, most people forget this, is what was done about missing data. Missing data can hugely bias your results. So if you show that you knew about this, that gets my attention, that here's somebody who kind of knows what they're doing. For the results, just make sure you have a flow chart and always have this table of who is in your study. Give your descriptive data first, give your means and your medians and your proportions, then your odds and ratios later. And then this is something I learned. If any of you know Dave Schreiger, who's at Annals, he's sort of the charts and figures guru. It's really important that if you use a figure, that it should show more than one piece of information. So it should show a comparison. Don't just say this is the percentage of males and females and give a pie chart. So pie charts are a sign of somebody that hasn't had a mentor. Let me put it that way. So, and then your discussion. I don't think anyone gets rejected because of their discussion, but try to keep it focused on these 5 things: summarizing your findings, explaining how they're different or similar to prior work, interpreting your main findings, what are the implications, and what are the limitations. And very important that you mention your limitations. Okay, what should you not do? So first of all, spin. If you have a negative result, it's a negative result. So I said, sell the research question, not the result. So don't say something was almost significant. Just tell the truth. Okay. You people do this because they think that we only publish positive result studies. That's called publication bias. But a good editor will try to see beyond that and say, was it a good question? Because a negative result to a good question is still an important answer. Please avoid using this is the first study too, because by the time your study comes out, it may not be. Instead, you can highlight your strengths. We had not this is the largest, but we had a very large population. We had this kind of data, et cetera, et cetera. Check for awkward grammar, mixed tenses, past and future, current, your typos, missing and extra words. I just learned about Grammarly, and it might be a way to check your work rather than just using whatever words grammar function is. It will kind of pick up this. It also does a very good job at telling you when you're using 3 words when you could use 1, and editors really like that. We like you to be very terse in your writing. And then check that your numbers add up and that they are similar in the text in the table. And don't overstate the value of your findings. So generally say something like, our results suggest this may improve outcomes and so forth. It's only one study. Next study out may completely disprove it or at least challenge it. So assume you are not the last word, because that's what research is. Research is building upon your work, and someone may take your work, replicate it, find something different, but because they found something different, we've learned something. Okay, things to do. Do read the instructions for authors to the T. The number, the format, the type of article, the word count, how to do your references, all of that. Look at your abstract again and again and again. Generally, we often write an abstract at the beginning because we're submitting it to a meeting. But by the time you finish writing your manuscript, you'll probably have known a lot more about what your data means. So go back to your abstract, look at it again, because this may be the only thing that your editor sees. It may only be the only thing that readers see. So really important. Have someone else critique your work, not a co-author. And this is really, really important. People worry about this, that someone's not going to feel I'm imposing. As a mentor, I love it when somebody asks me to look at their work. It's very flattering. We do not expect to be co-authors, so don't worry about that. But do take their advice if they're more senior and have been published. The cover letter, we had a discussion once with editors in panel about some editors never look at the cover letter. I tend to look at the cover letter when I don't understand the subject or I don't understand the importance. And then if the cover letter is good, it tells me what the relevance is and why it's important. And it doesn't just repeat the abstract. It might say, we found this and we think that this would change management this way, if it was replicated. So it's worth the time to write a good cover letter. As well as they want things in the cover letter often about your funding and your conflict of interests. Okay, what is the most important thing to do to get published? I would like everybody to write, what do you think the most important thing you need to do to get your paper published? Just take a guess. It's about, how many are you on here? It's 4 New America, okay?
I took a pass at my answer, which reveals some of my own limitations in the chat. My pass at an answer was actually submit it.
Yep. So that's it. Submit it. So I'm going to show you a little data. This is my data, so there's a little COI about it. And very long time ago, so I did this paper with Mike Callahan, who was editor of Annals. This was actually a spin-off of a paper that Mike did. So that's one way I got into research, is that Mike involved me in this study on the quality of abstracts and who gets abstracts accepted at SAEM. And we then said, oh, look at all these abstracts. We should find out if they've been published. And then we found these abstracts that had never been published. So I did a survey asking people, and it was in fact an unvalidated survey, asking people whether they had tried to publish. So first, the thing we found is there were 400 at this meeting. There were 492 abstracts submitted to SAEM, and less than half were published. Of those who didn't get published, that's who I surveyed, only 20% ever submitted a manuscript. Of those who submitted, 1/3 submitted to only one journal, and 2/3 only tried twice. Okay, and then I'm trying to see my chat. Good. Good, Dana. Yeah, Abstata, absolutely. Okay, and so then we also asked them, what was the most common reason for not submitting your paper? And what do you think it was? Any thoughts? So
The answer in the chat was thinking it's not good enough or time.
we gave a list of others that we don't think no one would be interested. It's got a negative outcome, but absolutely the main issue was time. So I'm not going to have time, so to speak, to go into that. But I do want to say that you've already done the research. So really, you need to find the time. That's really, basically ethical. You've already bothered a whole bunch of people to get this. So you got to find the time. But also think about the fact that you have probably written a proposal to get an IRB proposal. You may have already written the abstract to send it to SAEM. And when you've written your research proposal, you've probably written some level of methods. So you're halfway there. And so don't think about, I'm sitting down to write and you're staring at a blank piece of paper. Take your IRB proposal and edit it. Think about editing it. It'll look totally different when you're done, because everything that is, first of all, in the future tense is now going to be in the past tense, and you're going to add a lot more detail, but use it. It's so much easier to edit than to write. I know that sounds like semantics, but it's really different. So don't think about the fact that I'm starting with nothing. You're halfway there by the time you do this. And one thing, when you're doing your data collection, you can do things like make up dummy tables of what you think your patient population table, or your table 1. You can start looking at what your result tables will look like, because you've got outcomes that you said you're going to do. So make a table for each outcome, and then you'll have it sitting there ready for you to just fill in the blanks. Okay, so right, it's submitted. If it gets rejected, which happens to all of us, so welcome to the club, revise and submit it to another journal. How do you use that journal? Now, Bhakti mentioned something that she was told by Stefan Bruns, who was the editor of AFGEM for a long time. He uses Simago journal rankings. So what they do is they take the basically equivalent of an impact factor, and they rank the journals into 3 tiers. And he says, if you don't get into the first tier, revise and submit to the second tier. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily what I do. I think my journal, which is it's not annals. I think we do see a lot of papers that were submitted elsewhere, and we're still in the top tier. So you don't necessarily have to do that. But you could look at this to see if that will help you figure out, do I want to go to another tier? If you've tried JAMA, you certainly don't need to go to the second tier. Just go to something else in the first tier that's a little more realistic. If you're rejected again, revise and submit to another journal. And keep doing this. There's a person named Ian Chalmers who started the Cochrane reviews, the Cochrane systematic reviews, who basically said that failure to publish or research was unethical. So you have to try. Now, if it's bad research, we shouldn't publish it, but we should try. You should at least try and at least find out if it's bad research. And hopefully it's not, if you've got good mentorship and you have an IRB approval. So this is one of my studies, the first of 3 studies I did that got a lot of attention ultimately. This is, and I submitted this, it's now had 242 citations, and I submitted this to 3 journals before it was accepted at the 4th one. So, and it's done very well. So don't let rejections stop you or make you feel bad. It's just not for that journal. Just go keep looking. Okay. Now, one other thing, what other way to think about getting published is preprints. So if you don't know what preprints are, or you do, so these are, you take your paper and you just put it up on what's called a preprint server. And a number of journals host these preprint servers. So BMJ hosts a preprint server. And I went through it last night just to see what's on there. And you can actually, search by emergency medicine and so forth. So you just put your paper up here. And then the idea of this is that your paper gets into the public eye. Now, of course, you all know that this happened during COVID, and it was actually quite useful during COVID in getting papers, by getting information, scientific information out, rather than going through the long process of peer review and publication and holding for press release and all of those things. So this is very immediate. But the problem is these are not peer reviewed. And so there are also a lot of those preprints that were withdrawn over time, or that are just wrong, that we know are wrong. So why do you do it? You do it because you want to get it out there to somebody. And another reason to do it is you might get some comments, you might get some Twitter attention, and what you really hope for is that you get some comments that will make your paper better. But I have to say, when I looked at this last night, there were very few. I didn't find one emergency medicine paper that had comments. So I don't think it really is going to accomplish that for you, but it is a way to get your paper going. Now, in general, journals will accept papers for publication that have been in preprints. But do check before you post a preprint that your target journal is going to be the one that will take it. And finally, just remember this, that there are research letters, and research letters can be short, and they're considered peer-reviewed publications, not letters. And they're actually, what's nice about them is they don't contribute to our impact factor, which means it's kind of a free ride for the journal, that we can post this, and it will, if it doesn't ever get cited, it's fine. And also, it doesn't take up much space in the journal. So we have maybe more likely to publish your study if you can make it into a research letter. They're hard to do, so get advice how to do them, but they are a better way in. So I'll summarize here, just as I've gone over. And you don't need to kind of hear all this. And all I'll just say is thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me at my email address. Thanks.